Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. So, welcome everybody back to Politics Chat on June 9th. You can see I've figured out how to label that on the screen so that people don't get confused in the future. And there's a lot going on. Let me start today with something that came to people's attention today that I think illuminates a lot of where we are right now, because we seem to be at that place in a society, but I think of it kind of as water, where we're in real chop. That is, for 40 years, the Republicans have been really pushing a version of society that I'll explain more about, that we're seeing the outcome of now. And Americans don't like it. And they are in the process of fighting back against it and articulating a different way to think about the country. That ideology that the Republicans really began to push in response to the New Deal that first the Democrats and then the Republicans embraced after World War II. That New Deal idea that the government should regulate business, provide a basic social safety net, promote infrastructure, protect civil rights, and help to underpin an international rules-based order. In order to push back against that, reactionaries said, no, we don't want those things. Those things waste tax dollars, and regulation makes it impossible for men, especially who they're talking about, to organize their businesses the way they can, or the way that they want to. And the idea of using government resources to protect civil rights, for example, or to invest in infrastructure, or even to underpin that international rules-based order, is a waste of tax dollars. And so they developed this ideology that Ronald Reagan begins to talk about and gets elected to do. And that is based on a much older idea. And what they say is that the government should not regulate business, because that makes it impossible for people to run their businesses as they wish, and it makes it harder for them to accumulate money. And that the government should not be a part of have a basic social safety net, or promote infrastructure, or protect civil rights, or underpin that rules-based international order, because that takes tax dollars. And what the government really should be doing is it should be cutting taxes and cutting regulation. And there's a lot of justifications for that. And one of the terms you might have heard is supply side economics. And what that argued was that what the government really should do is it should protect the supply side, that is the people with money in a society, rather than the demand side, that is the people, workers and consumers who buy things. They should protect the demand side, because if you permitted money to concentrate among a very small group of people, they would invest in the economy in really efficient ways, and that would mean extraordinary economic growth, and everybody would get jobs, and everybody would just be happy as a clam at high tide, right? That idea has really been the driving principle behind the larger economic vision and the larger ideology of the Republican Party since at least the 1980s. The problem with it is it never worked. And there are long roots to it in America, behind it in American history, that I won't go into and bore you with now. But this system had never worked. It never created extraordinary economic growth. And in the 1980s, when a lot of people thought that Reagan had proved that it did, in fact, what really drove the economic growth of the 80s was extraordinary deficit spending on the part of Reagan, and new lowered interest rates as well, but and some deregulation as well. But the reason I mention that is because one of the key questions that you've asked today is, what is this that you're hearing about from Michael Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who's a Republican of Louisiana, about cutting Social Security, cutting Medicaid, cutting Medicare? This literally has been central to the ideology of the Republicans for at least 40 years. You've heard of it in different ways. You've heard about it, them talking about privatizing these institutions. You've heard about cuts. Now, the way the Republicans are trying to sell this is by insisting that there is extraordinary fraud in Medicaid and in Social Security, and you're hearing this, that they're insisting there's fraud in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, by the way. And there's a really important distinction when they talk about that. And by the way, all the material I draw from is public material, and you can see this in congressional reports. But often, what people like the United States Department of Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins will say is that, oh, we have these really high fraud rates in things like SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And in fact, what she is doing is she is referring to error rates. And the same is true of Medicaid, by the way. Error rates mean that when they fill out the documentation, they have coded something wrong. Or if for Medicaid, or in the case of SNAP, sometimes it means that there were overpayments or underpayments. That is not the same thing as fraud. And even Congress, this Republican Congress, will say that actually fraud rates, that is somebody deliberately defrauding these programs to get higher supplemental nutrition assistance, for example, or Medicaid payments for individuals, those rates are very, very small. So when you see that, those claims of really high rates, do make sure that they are really talking about fraud, because I have yet to see them actually referring to fraud. They're referring to error rates, which means that, again, somebody coded something wrong. And that happens at a pretty decent rate. But even in Minnesota, where you're hearing so much about Medicaid fraud there, what they're talking about is error rates. And those error rates, by the way, in Minnesota are significantly lower than they are in many other states. Anyway, what Johnson said yesterday on a podcast, and by the way, I thought this was interesting because he has said something similar in the past and also walked away from it and said, oh, you misunderstood me. And when I saw those reports today about what he had said, I assumed it was an older report and that people were just reprinting it now and, newly being shocked by it. But no, in fact, it appears he said it yesterday. And what he said was that he is anticipating cuts next year to Social Security because the United States can't possibly manage its really dramatically rising debt. And our national debt, remember there's a difference in the deficit and the debt. Deficit is the amount of the delta between how much money the United States takes in a year and how much it pays out in a year. And that deficit is high, and our debt is also rising dramatically under Donald Trump. Dramatically. The same way it did during his first term, when it rose faster than, even without the pandemic, rose faster than in any other administration, except ones during wartime, percentage-wise, like World War II or the Civil War. As you know, if you follow me, I am virtually innumerate when it comes to math. Sixes and nines look the same to me and all that. But the actual way that a society spends money fascinates me. That's how it shows what it cares about. So, I think sometimes people hear about taxes, or they hear about these different financial programs, and they think, oh, I don't like money. I can't do money. I can't do numbers. If you have any interest at all, take heart from me, who really does have a very, very hard time with numbers. But the larger concepts, I really find fascinating, and they're not hard to understand for me anyway. So it's possible not to be able to add a 6 and a 9 and still be able to understand these larger concepts of how we're spending money. Anyway, if that's the deficit, the debt is also, as I say, going up dramatically. Johnson is right about that. Just be clear, Johnson is right about that. And some people say we don't have to worry about that rising debt. There are other people who are really concerned about it. I happen to be very concerned about it. I think that we should not bear, I do actually like to have a national debt. I think it's a good thing for a number of reasons. But not to the point that so much of your taxes are going to servicing that debt, paying the interest on it. Anyway, um, I know there's other schools of thought, and I know my email is going to be flooded with it. I promise you, I've read those books too. It just happens to be where I stand on that issue. Um, but but in the past, when we have had debts like this, a national debt like this, the first place Congress always went, the first place Congress always went was to progressive taxation. People who make a lot of money should pay more. And one of the things that has really caused the problem we're at now is the massive tax cuts, primarily those under George W. Bush and under Donald Trump. There were also tax cuts, of course, under Ronald Reagan. But where we are now, if you think about it, under Bill Clinton in the 1990s, in fact, we were operating the black. We did not have a deficit. And it's the tax cuts since then, along with the two unfunded wars, that have really sent our debt and our deficit skyrocketing. But Johnson, instead of saying, hey, we really got to raise taxes here, what he has turned to is we really need to cut more services for the American people. I'm going to go somewhere with this, by the way. But we are in this moment. And if you look around at the way that the Republicans in power are spending money, one of the things that happened this afternoon is that since the Senate passed the measure, the budget reconciliation measure, to put $70 billion more dollars into Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and CBP, or Customs and Border Protection, which is the parent agency of Border Patrol, despite the fact that their budget had already been exploded in last July's budget reconciliation measure, also passed only with Republican votes. That's why they use budget reconciliation. It can't be filibustered, which means that they could pass it with no Democratic votes. That means that the Republicans have decided that rather than putting money into extending the Affordable Care Act marketplace supports, for example, or into SNAP, or into infrastructure projects, or anything that the American people seem to want, they are adding another $70 billion to ICE and Customs and Border Protection, even though those things are not popular in the United States. And that's worth thinking about, because they are choosing to spend our tax dollars on this incredibly powerful and growing paramilitary organization that is rounding up immigrants, including often immigrants that are here legally, incarcerating them indefinitely before deportation, and denying them access to the court system, except in a very nominal way at places like Delaney Hall in New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey. All right. What does that mean? What does that mean to have, what we're doing is we're taking our tax dollars, we're cutting taxes for the very wealthy and for corporations. And the ideology behind that, again, says this should make the economy boom. We should have really big economic growth, and that should help everybody. But it's never done that. In 80 years, it has never produced, 40 years, it has never produced unusually high economic growth. And in fact, under the Biden administration, they went back to the system that the Republicans and Democrats both had used after World War II. And that was investing in the supply side, in the demand side, in workers and consumers and, SNAP benefits and all that. And that's when we had the extraordinary economic growth after the pandemic. It's one of the reasons that there was high inflation immediately after the pandemic, but that improvement in the ability of workers to buy stuff, for their wages to go up faster than inflation went up, really helped to grow the economy. Anyway, so it means that we've invested in tax cuts, and we are investing in this paramilitary organization, which is providing, again, billions of dollars to private prison companies like the Geo Group or Core Civic, which are two of the major private prison companies in the United States, who are running these facilities to make money and that are investing in Republican Congress people to keep those votes coming, and are currently in the news for apparently forcing detainees to do their own cleaning and so on, which is actually illegal under the circumstances it's happening. Anyway, so that's what that's how we are spending our money. And in contracts that go into this system. And we are cutting under Trump and this administration things like the people who monitor the migration of the New World screwworm. And this is one of those things that people weren't paying attention to. There are many things that you didn't have to pay attention to because you knew that the government was keeping an eye on stuff. So you didn't have to worry about the arrival from Latin America of this truly horrific fly whose larva eats live flesh. And I've talked about this before. Larva, the little white things, maggots, the larva of flies usually eat dead flesh. And as a result, that meant that they used to be used to clean out wounds and still are sometimes to clean out wounds because they're actually pretty efficient at cleaning out dead flesh. I'm sorry, I should have warned you I was going to go into that. Civil War I know a lot about Civil War medicine, which is sort of interesting, really interesting, actually. Maybe that's a rabbit hole I won't go down right now at the dinner hour. But the New World screwworm actually eats live flesh. And that's a real problem for herds, especially cattle herds, any kind of animals, or even potentially humans, because they cause enormous damage to the herds. They also cause extremely painful wounds. But what this is doing is that because under the Department of Government Efficiency, the United States cut its monitoring programs, we now have the New World screwworm back in the United States for the first time since 1966. Which of course is hurting the cattle industry, and cattle industry leaders had begged the government not to cut those monitoring programs, and they said it was wasteful, so they did, and now here we are with the New World screwworm back. Similarly, the Trump administration has vowed to get rid of the ocean sensor buoys, hundreds of them in the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, which monitor ocean currents, monitor ocean resources, and check the temperatures and the currents and so on for the effects of climate change. And that is about many things. It is certainly about the potential for extraordinarily dangerous storms, but also the sensing of ocean currents is a really, really big deal, both because of the way it means marine resources move, but also because the slowing or the alteration of those currents can indicate the arrival of really extreme weather patterns. And they're saying they're going to tear these things up because they say they're a waste of money, when in fact it's pretty clear that they're an incredibly efficient use of money and that they will protect the American people. And they were supposed to last for 26 years, and now the Trump administration wants to tear them out after 10 because they really don't want to have proof we have to deal with climate change because of the different things that they're trying to put through in terms of the use of fossil fuels. So we're tearing up the things that actually protect the American people with our tax dollars, and instead doing things like funding tax cuts for the very wealthy and for corporations, and things like ICE and Border Patrol. So what's going on with this? This is a worldview. Rather than saying that our tax dollars should be used to help the American people, they are explicitly saying our tax dollars should actually be used to fund systems that benefit the very wealthy and corporations. And when I said early on that we're sort of at this place of chop, and by that it's a reference to water. When water gets, it doesn't really have waves, it's choppy. The American people are looking around us and recognizing that the administration is costing us enormously in terms of the cost of food, the cost of housing, the cost of gasoline. We're losing our health care. Now we're involved in this war in Iran. And just before I came on, I read that we are launching strikes against Iran again. That's costing us about $1 billion a day. And thinking, wait a minute, this is not what we signed up for. So, what we are seeing in this moment is the fact that those people who adhere to that ideology backed Donald Trump because Donald Trump could continue to convince voters to back him. And once they backed him, they would be able to put in place and keep in place this system. And now that he is starting to waver, they're trying to grab as much as they possibly can. And what does that mean? First of all, remember that Trump is in office because he wanted to stay out of jail. Had been indicted for two really major issues by special counsel Jack Smith. One was his attempt to overturn the presidential election of 2020, and one, his retention of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. And that was a really, really big deal. And they're both really big deals. And when he announced he was running for president, that meant that, once somebody was involved in the presidency and now that he is president, you can't, according to a memo from the Department of Justice, it's never been tried in court, and it's not a congressional law or a law that passed by Congress that you can't prosecute a sitting president. Anyway, one of the things that you're watching with Trump right now is that he is trying desperately to protect himself from any kind of legal repercussions for the things he might have done illegally. And the thing to keep your eye on right now, there's so much going on, but one of the things to keep your eyes on right now is his attempt to get Todd Blanche confirmed as the Attorney General of the United States. Now, remember, the Attorney General is the top law enforcement official in the country. He's supposed to be the person responsible to the American people for the execution of the laws. And Blanche is as corrupt as the day is long. Remember, he was Trump's personal attorney, and then he became the deputy attorney general. And as deputy attorney general, he is the one who not only backed the deal for the slush fund of speaking of places our money is going, of $1.776 billion to pay off people who were convicted of crimes related to Trump's attempt to overturn the presidential election of 2020, but also of the accompanying document with that said that the federal government would not prosecute Trump, his oldest sons, or the Trump organization for any crimes they might have committed with regard to. It's not entirely clear if it was just limited to the IRS or to other agencies as well. But I just gotta hammer on here this idea. And by the way, even though they have sort of backed off on the slush fund, they are adamant. Blanche is adamant that second part of the deal was going to stay in place. And by the way, the deal was completely trumped up. There was no, it was just a deal. Like it wasn't a settlement. I've talked about that before. It was just a deal. Just a get out of jail free card. And Blanche has been very clear that remains in place as far as he is concerned. But remember with that the second I heard that, I thought Al Capone. And what I mean by that is Al Capone was a bootlegger and a gangster during Prohibition. And Prohibition is a period when the machine politics that really ran a number of cities in the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century become pretty heavily controlled by organized crime. And the reason for that is because they'd always sort of hit up shopkeepers and so on for protection, or work together with police and fire organizations in the 19th century. That's just kind of the way machine politics worked. But once you get the injection of the extraordinary money associated with bootlegging, those machine politics become organized crime. And if anybody's ever interested in this, it's actually quite an interesting story. Um, there is in Las Vegas a museum called the Mob Museum, which talks about the rise of the organized crime, largely in Las Vegas, but it does talk about it elsewhere. And it's really quite good on this and really interesting on it, because there's this real question: how do you get the change from machine politics like Tammany Hall in New York City to actual organized crime? And the organized crime that's going to give us the kinds of shooting deaths that lead to the United States barring automatic weapons. We have semi-automatic weapons, and we have weapons that can be altered to repeat at an extraordinary rate. But technically, we do not. It is not legal to have an automatic weapon in the United States because of the bootleggers in the 1920s. And by the way, and now I'll really climb out of this rabbit hole. If you know your Great Gatsby, you know that Gatsby is a bootlegger. That's where his fortune comes from. And he is tied to organized crime. And you know that because he's tied to the guy in the book who is when they're talking about him, who is responsible for rigging the 1919 World Series. All right, I will climb back out of the organized crime hole, but only to the point where I will explain that the reason I just did this deep dive in that is because one of the big gangsters of the 20s is Al Capone. And Al Capone is deeply involved in bootlegging and in organized crime and in murder. But what the federal government gets him on is none of those things, because he always managed to keep his hands pretty clean so that you couldn't see what he was doing. They got him for tax evasion. And I don't understand why more of us aren't recognizing that, saying that whatever the Trump organization might have done over its taxes, we're just going to say, never mind about. Anyway, so Blanche is trying to give Trump this get out of jail free card on that, but he also has been acting as Trump's enforcer through the Department of Justice to do things like get indictments against former director of the FBI, James Comey, for posting that image on Instagram of the seashells arranged to say 8647. But the real thing to be thinking about with Blanche right now, and I'm a little surprised we're not hearing more about this, is, although it is out there, is Blanche has been instrumental in covering up the Epstein files. Okay, instrumental in that. And what I mean by that is, remember, it was Blanche, who was Trump's personal attorney, who represented him in the case of him falsifying records to cover up payments to Stormy Daniels, the adult film actress. It's Blanche who had the 9-hour 2-day interview with Ghislaine Maxwell, who is Epstein's associate, who is in prison for sex trafficking, I believe it is a sexual offense, and who, after that interview last summer, somehow Ghislaine Maxwell got transferred from the prison in which she was being held to a minimum security prison camp to which sexual offenders are not technically allowed to be transferred. And after that, she, they made the administration made a big deal about the fact she said nothing that tied Trump to Epstein's sexual assault of children. And they did that right after the Wall Street Journal had released the article tying Trump to Epstein through that birthday card that apparently bore Trump's signature for Epstein's 50th birthday. So that was Blanche. But then, if you remember, and I'm sure you do, Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which said that no later than December 19th of 2025, the Department of Justice must, not should, must release all, not some, all of the Epstein files. And those could not be redacted except to protect survivors. And to date, they have released about half of them, it appears, and many of them are heavily redacted. They are simply ignoring the law, flouting the law. And Pam Bondi testified before Congress recently saying, and she was not under oath. Just remember that. And I always tell you to watch for who's under oath. And James Comer, the chair of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, doesn't want any of these people under oath, and the Democrats do want them under oath. But she testified that all of the decisions about the Epstein files came from Todd Blanche. So what Trump is doing when he is demanding that Senate Republicans confirm Todd Blanche is he's saying, I don't care that you voted unanimously to force me to release those files. I want you to give me a get out of jail free card on the Epstein files. Not only on the possible tax evasion for which people like Al Capone went to jail, but also on the Epstein files. I want people to hear that because Republicans as well as Democrats want those files out. And that's what's at stake with Blanche. That's what's at stake. They are saying, Trump is saying to the Senate Republicans, I don't care that you voted for this. I don't care that your constituents want these files out. I want to get out of jail free card over the Epstein files. So that is part of what is going on with that people should have their eye on. But also part of what Blanche will do is he will rubber stamp the extraordinary corruption that we're seeing coming out of this administration now. And that's corruption not only in things like the Ultimate Fighting Championship cage matches that are going to be held in front of the White House on Saturday, unless this lawsuit that has been filed stops that from happening. And of course, this is a marketing opportunity, and UFC officials have even said that. And Trump bought stock in UFC before the fight, but also in things that you're seeing repeatedly now, the fact that Trump family members buy stock in a startup, for example, or a small company. And then either foreign investment comes in. There was a piece today that talked about the administration putting huge pressure on a billionaire family in India, which turned around and invested in a huge amount of money in a small startup company in Texas that Donald Trump Jr. had invested in. That stock or that company became a great deal more valuable. It is now talking about going public, even though it looks as if it really will never be able to do what it claims it was going to do. And all of a sudden, the tariffs that were hurting that family in India went away. But you've seen that repeatedly with a small startup company getting an investment from a Trump family member, and then getting, for example, a contract from the Pentagon to produce drones. You've seen it in the degree to which Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, is associated with Middle Eastern money, including at least $2 billion from Saudi Arabia for his investment fund, and his attempts now, since he is supposed to be negotiating for the United States, to drum up more money for that investment account among Middle Eastern kingdoms. So you saw that recently as well with the protests you're seeing in Albania, where the Kushners, again, that same investment fund, has invested in a pristine land, a beachfront and an island, which is incidentally riddled with bunkers and so on. Interesting that they have acquired that protected island with the nod from the Prime Minister of Albania, with opponents accuse the minister of trying to buy favor with the Trump administration. And so going ahead and letting the Kushner brand get control of this pristine, protected land to build a resort, a $1.6 billion resort. At the same time, you're seeing not only this attempt of the Trump family to accumulate power through money and corruption, but you can see increasing pressure from the white nationalists and um, the Christian nationalists in the Trump administration to grab a lot of power, as well as the tech bros. And what I mean by that is the white nationalists are the ones who want to create a white nation. And just to reiterate, the United States of America has never been a white nation and has not seen itself as a white nation except in a very small way, people before the Civil War who were trying to push the idea of a white nation or the KKK or so on. This has always been a nation, a multicultural nation. I always like to point out that Muslims one of the things that the white nationalists right now are going after is Muslims. And Muslims have been here, the first two Europeans to be in the North American continent on what became the United States of America. One was Catholic and one was Muslim. So even before the Protestants came, you had a Catholic and a Muslim. And of course, Muslims have been in the United States in decent numbers, in big numbers, really, since the arrival of enslaved Africans in 1619 to what was going to become the United States of America. So that's, again, I'll climb out of that rabbit hole, but it just kind of makes my head explode when people say that this is a white nation. Anyway, the white nationalists are attacking immigrants with increasing ferocity as they are watching Trump crumble. And what I mean by that is people like Greg Bovino, who used to be a director of Border Patrol. He was the person behind Border Patrol in Minneapolis when Border Patrol agents shot and killed Alex Preddy and Renee Good. And he has resurfaced doing things like giving a Nazi salute and participating in what was called a remigration conference in Portugal. And you asked what remigration means. Technically, it means people who have migrated to a country going back home to a country, but that's just the technical meaning. It has been co-opted by the far right to mean ethnic cleansing, and that means taking people from a different country and their descendants, even if they have naturalized, and forcing them to go back to whatever country they migrated from. And that is part of the goal of the people who keep talking about, as Pete Hegseth did over the weekend at the D-Day celebrations, of this idea that there is an invasion. They keep using that word, an invasion of African or Asian peoples into European countries and into the United States of America. And that language, you see Trump echoing that language too, and they're pushing that harder and harder. Tom Homan, who used to be an advisor to the GEO Group, is also talking about cracking down again in New York City over the course of 2024. You're also seeing that, and there you have that passage of the measure that gives $70 more billion to ICE and border customs and border protection. And you're also seeing a real attempt on the part of the Christian nationalists, the ones who want to impose theocracy on us, to push their ideology. And you saw that with Hegseth's attempt over the weekend to cease, for the Pentagon to cease recognizing 180 different faith traditions or spiritual beliefs from things that the military would recognize, and he had to back off on that. But you can see that happening. All right, so where is this going, and where are we going to go with it today? You also asked a number of questions, and by the way, it's always fun for me to see if I can turn all your questions into a coherent narrative. It's kind of a game for me, and I like it because what it says to me is, like, you get all these different channels of thought, and where where does the story come out of them? And a lot of people are still complaining about the fact that the Democrats do not seem to have a coherent line of objections to what's going on. And I can't tell you how profoundly I disagree with that. From the beginning, I have said we want all voices in the pushback against the rise of authoritarianism. And that I mean that not only because that's good for political organizing, you want a lot of people to be engaged, but also because we need to have a new ideology for the United States of America going forward into the 21st century, because we got new stuff to deal with. We got climate change, we've got migration, we've got the rise of artificial intelligence and the extraordinary demands that it makes on water and on electricity and so on. And so who knows? I mean, what people are going to say about that. My world is very different than the world of 20-year-olds. And it's important, I think, for both of us to be heard. So one of the things that are seeing is a number of new voices beginning to coalesce around certain ideas. And I want to really emphasize that one of the ways that the radical right has gained power, and these are extraordinary radicals, by the way, the people who are running things right now, they are not in the mainstream of American thought. They are extremists. And what they did is they managed to convince voters that liberals, and liberals, the term liberal just means that you believe that the government should regulate business, provide a basic social safety net, promote infrastructure, protect civil rights, and be involved in the international community to try to do things like stop wars, and protect the freedom of the seas for trade. That they convinced people that liberals, who are not just Democrats, who are also independents and Republicans. This is Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon and everybody right up to Donald Trump and past that. It includes George H.W. Bush, that all of those people are somehow anti-American leftists. But the reality is, as we are watching the extremists destroy that country that we worked so hard to build, the one that protected against screwworm and tried to get people health care and tried to make sure people had food to eat and tried to make sure that we had freedom of the seas so that we could actually trade without having Iran put a toll on the Strait of Hormuz on 20% of the world's oil. That as we are watching them collapse that world, those of us, Democrats, independents, and Republicans, who believe in that basic idea that the government should protect an individual's ability to determine her or his future, we are starting to push back on that and articulate a pushing back on that. And it's coming from all these different voices. It's not just coming from elected Democrats. It's coming from anti-Trump Republicans. It's coming from traditional Republicans who are like, I just can't live with what they're doing in Delaney Hall, but I still think of myself as a Republican. It's coming from independents. And what it is beginning to coalesce around is a couple of things, and we're only beginning to see this now, I think, but you are increasingly seeing people like John Ossoff, a senator in Georgia, articulate extraordinary anger at the corruption that we are seeing. Jamie Raskin, a representative from Maryland, talks about the corruption. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, talks about the corruption. You're seeing people say, why is our money going into things like these ICE facilities that Kristi Noem bought when she was the head of the Department of Government, the Department of Homeland Security, that at least in one case, there's been a lawsuit over saying she paid 5 times the market value of that facility, that warehouse. That's our tax dollars. Why is there a 5 times delta between the assessed value of the property and what we paid for it? And who got that difference? You're starting to see people calling out the corruption, but on the heels of that corruption, that calling out, you're also seeing people articulating what we would like to see, what we would like our country to do. And that is things like protect against screwworm, see about getting health care, making housing more affordable, doing the things that it will take to make America stronger as a community going forward into 2021. And so there is this race between the fact that Trump is crumbling, and both physically and in terms of popularity, that debacle at the third game of the championship game yesterday was, indicative. When the president gets booed so badly that you can't even hear the national anthem, and then gets blamed. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Some people might not have seen the game. Never mind. Um, things aren't good. And then for him to say, "Oh, they were cheering me." I'm like, "Oh, come on, dude. You are absolutely delusional." And of course, mentally he's fallen asleep. Yeah, well, anyway, I always talk about that. You know about that. They're trying to grab as much power as they possibly can as it's all falling apart. And at the same time, we as a community are trying to build up a vision of the future that includes as much of us as possible so we can push back against that. And here's the final place I will leave you, the final topic on which I will leave you, is that you can tell that the Republicans know they have lost power, that the American people don't want them to continue in power. How do you know that? Yeah, people complain about the polls and all that, so ignore the polls. You know it because they rushed through gerrymandering of a number of Republican dominated states to essentially steal seats in the House of Representatives in an attempt to try and overcome their unpopularity. Even though, according to pollster um, G. Elliott Morris, who does Strength in Numbers, even still, he thinks that the wave is strong enough that probably is not going to be enough for them. They tried to do that, but you know how you really see it? In two other ways. One is that Trump and his minions are clearly trying to sow doubt in the outcome of the election. And you see that in their complaints about the Los Angeles mayor's race, where a former reality TV star, I guess, I don't know who he was, tried to run for the head of LA as a Republican. It's a Democratic city. And when he didn't, in fact, win in his primary, in the larger primary, Trump is out there screaming that there's something wrong with the election, and there just isn't. There, I mean, this is just the way it takes time to count in California, and so on. But you can see they're taking out for a test drive the idea that the elections are not going to be secure in 2026 because they're afraid they're going to lose them the same way he did in 2020. And when he started talking about the election being stolen months ahead of it, and the fact that they did the same thing in 2016. By the way, Roger Stone got the URL "Stop the Steal" long before the election. I mean, they're basically just saying, unless we win, we're going to argue that the election was stolen. And you can see it by the fact that Trump has installed Bill Pulte, or William Pulte, at the head of the DNI, is the director of national intelligence. And that is an incredibly important position to protect Americans against terrorism, basically, from other countries. And he has no experience in this at all, but it's pretty clear he will weaponize the intelligence that he does get as head of the DNI in order to use it against those who are working to oppose Trump and the Republicans in the 2026 election. Now, you don't do that unless you are worried that you're going to lose the election. And he did it by installing Pulte as an acting DNI, for which he doesn't need Senate confirmation. So you can see that they're very worried about this upcoming election, and that's why. But now what can we do, those of us who care about democracy? And somebody said, how are we going to convince these Trumpers to vote for Trump? You're not going to get all the Trumpers. And remember, even in the days before the bunker, Adolf Hitler, still his popularity was still over 20%. I mean, they're just, there's just always going to be those people. The people who need to come out in 2026 are the people who didn't vote in 2024, and new voters, people who are just now saying, hey, maybe I should get involved here, either because they've aged into the process or because now they're paying attention. Those are the people we need to reach. And we need to reach them by calling out the corruption, calling out the ways in which our tax dollars are being used to hurt our neighbors or to put money in the pockets of um, the people who own stock in private corporations that are running the detention facilities, or the ways in which our the administration is literally pocketing, the Trump family has pocketed, I believe it's $2.3 billion in crypto funds. Don't quote me on that one. That study came out today from Reuters. This is not okay. This is absolutely not okay. The government and our tax dollars, remember, the government is us. Our tax dollars is supposed to help us. You and I might disagree about what we should do, but I can promise you we agree that it shouldn't go into the pockets of Don Jr. At least that's how I feel about it. So the trick here is going to be mobilizing those people who didn't vote and new voters, and making sure people understand the stakes. And one of the places that you asked me, like, is it worth still calling members of Congress? 100%. But one of the real places to put pressure on Congress people right now, especially Republican senators, is over the confirmation of Blanche. Call and say how much you care about the Epstein files. And Blanche is the guy who hid them, because they voted, Republican senators voted unanimously to require the release of those Epstein files. And Blanche said, ha, not doing it. So they are already on record as caring about that. And now they are being asked to push Blanche through and basically say those files are never coming out. So calling them and saying, I care about this, I voted for Trump because of this, or this is something I care deeply about, that actually is going to matter going forward into these confirmation hearings. So all I can say is we're at a dead run to see whether the American people are going to be able to reclaim their country or not. And let's keep our skin in the game on this one, because it is all crumbling in front of the MAGA Republicans, but they're grabbing as much as they can before it crumbles. So all we can do is keep on fighting to make sure that we gather all of us who care about democracy up together to make a difference in 2026 and beyond. It's not just 2026. A very dear member of my team is older, and I have begged that person to stay on board until at least 2029, because even my short-term vision goes to 2029. So we're pace yourselves, but we're in this for the long haul. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend, about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.